Hello, everyone. This morning we are going to be talking about trench warfare and life in the trenches in World War I for the common soldier. So, what you see here in front of you on this map is the trench works that extended all the way from the Alps to the North Sea. While looking at this map, the dotted lines are roughly where you would find the trenches, and those kind of like brownish areas are the major battlefields of the First World War. I want to point out a couple of them so that you can orient yourself in your mind. So, in the previous video I did, we talked about the Battle of the Marne, and you can see right here, this is where the Battle of the Marne was fought. You will also have read about the Battle of the Somme, which is right up here, and the Battle of Verdun, which you will see is right here. A little bit later on, you're going to read about the Third Battle of Passchendaele, which is also known as the Battle of Ypres, and that you will see all the way up here. Now, these various battlefields you will notice are pretty much all contained within France and Belgium. And this is actually really important because when we get to the end of the First World War, Germany is going to feel as if it hadn't truly lost the war because it was consistently within French and Belgian territory, or at least the German people were going to feel that way. The German government knew quite a bit better. Now, the trenches of the First World War were constructed in a variety of ways. They could be very simple ditches dug into the earth, like you see here, with only the most minimal support to hold back the earth. You sometimes might see more elaborate constructions where you have actual wood siding to them to hold them up, maybe some corrugated steel in order to do that as well. Or you may get even more elaborate constructions yet, which would feature sandbags and concrete and duckboards at the bottom to walk on. Now, the average World War I soldier would spend anywhere from 1 day to 2 weeks in a frontline trench. Roughly about 15% of their year was spent living in a frontline trench. The average would be about 6 days, and that number is taken from the Canadian 10th Battalion, which actually fought in every major battle of the First World War. Life in the trenches was, in short, pretty miserable for the people living there. The trenches were exposed to the elements. Dugout areas underneath the earth were reserved pretty much for officers or members of the higher command. The average soldier, they slept, they ate, they went to the bathroom, all in this exposed environment, all with the knowledge that if you stuck your head up above the trench, there was a very good chance that you would get shot. Statistics show that even when there was not a major battle going on, for British soldiers, there was a 50% chance that simply by being in a frontline trench, when you were rotated back to either a reserve trench or rest duty, 50% chance that you would have suffered some kind of injury. Now, the battlefields of World War I, like I said, are mostly in Belgium and France. And unlike Texas, it can be pretty rainy or snowy in Belgium and France. They get a lot more precipitation than we do here. Because the trenches were in low-lying areas, they were very prone to flooding. And so what you saw is that on a lot of these battlefields, soldiers would be submerged in water for most of the time that they were in these frontline trenches. There was really no escape from this water. You couldn't climb up out of the trenches to get away from them because, well, you risked yourself doing so. Now, Ypres, Third Battle of Passchendaele, was notorious for the standing water and the mud that was in the trenches. And when we talk about that one, many of the deaths can actually be attributed to people drowning within the mud. Now, with this much stagnant water in the trenches were also exceptionally filthy and unhygienic. Rats were extremely common in the trenches. And of course, as we know from studies of the Black Death, rats carry all sorts of other little parasites on them, including lice. Now, on the subject of lice, very quickly, lice were responsible for what was known as the trench fever. Trench fever was a disease that lice transmitted that would result in various symptoms. Those would be shin pain, an enlargement of the spleen, some fairly bad headaches, a severely decreased quality of life. And many soldiers, even after World War I, suffered prolonged health effects from trench fever. Now, in an effort to try to minimize this, the soldiers would go regularly on rat hunts. And keep in mind, these trenches were home to millions and millions of rats. So as you can see in this picture, the soldiers have a Jack Russell Terrier, and they are proudly displaying all of the rats that this Jack Russell managed to kill. But soldiers would also go and bayonet the rats themselves during downtime. Another parasite that was very common in the trenches were tapeworms. Because there was absolutely no hygiene related to food preparation, tapeworms got into almost everything in the trenches. They got into the rashes, they got into the rats, and so people were ingesting tapeworms and suffering the negative health effects of that as well. Another big problem in the trenches was disposal of dead bodies. Again, it was extremely difficult to remove dead bodies from the trenches, and in many cases, the dead bodies were simply used as building material. They would be packed into the sides of trenches, buried over very hastily in dirt. And the dead bodies actually drew a lot more rats and a lot more parasites into the trenches. They also smelled absolutely terrible. Now, when it rained, oftentimes these dead bodies would become unearthed, and you can only imagine the kind of terrible conditions people would be living in with these decomposing dead bodies sitting in this standing water at the bottom of a trench near where people are eating or trying to sleep. It was absolutely filthy and disgusting and unimaginable for most of us in today's society. Naturally, this resulted in quite a few diseases. The most notable of those was dysentery. Dysentery is caused by microbes getting into your water supply, which you then ingest. And the biggest symptom of dysentery is uncontrolled diarrhea. Now, again, you can probably imagine that in the trenches, there are very few opportunities to go to the restroom. And so in many cases, people were going right there at the bottom of the trench. When it rained, the feces containing those microbes would be spread throughout the trench lines. We have stories of soldiers who would actually take off their helmets and use their helmets as portable toilets, and then they would go and fling their waste out over the lip of the trench onto the battlefield. So it was absolutely disgusting. And of course, once you've used your helmet that way, you don't have many options to clean it, so you are probably without a helmet. So dysentery was actually very widespread, but surprisingly, typhoid fever, which is usually common in these unhygienic situations, was not quite present in the trenches, but dysentery, far and away, very, very common. Now, the last thing to talk about is what's known as trench foot. Trench foot was a fungal infection that would result from your feet being in submerged, dirty water for prolonged periods of time. Trench foot was more common amongst American soldiers than any other group of soldiers in the First World War. Trench foot in its most minor form would cause itching, skin peeling, rash, irritation. In its most severe form, which you see up here, it would result in necrosis of the foot. So what you're looking at is someone whose skin, muscle, and bone have actually died because of this fungal infection. And of course, this person has died as well, because once you sepsis, which is when these microbes get into your bloodstream, it's very, very difficult to cure, especially at a time where antibacterials and antibiotics were very uncommon. So, in short, life in the trenches for these soldiers was absolutely horrible, and it produced a significant amount of mental illness, which was largely not understood at the time. The most notable would be shell shock, which we know today is post-traumatic stress disorder. Soldiers would have breakdowns, nervous breakdowns, or anxiety attacks due to phobia, due to fear of rats, because soldiers would wake up in the middle of the night with rats like nibbling on them. And every soldier who came back from World War I, if they weren't physically scarred by the experience, they were most likely mentally scarred from the experience. All right, everyone. Well, that concludes our little talk today on life in the trenches during the First World War. And even though trenches were most common on the Western front of the conflict, you would find them really on most battlefields. You'd find them significantly on the Eastern Front as well, and then portions of the newly opened Southern Front when that winds up occurring. So as you look into the future lessons that we're going to be discussing, just keep in mind that this is what the daily life looks like for your average World War I soldier. All right, everyone, have a good day, and I will talk to you again soon.